This is Michael Matheson Miller, and you are listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. Thank you for listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. My guest today is Flagg Taylor, and we're going to discuss the work of the Czech playwright, dissident, and political figure, president of the Czech Republic after the fall of the Soviet Union, Vaclav Havel. So Flagg Taylor is a professor of political science at Skidmore University in New York State. He's the editor of The Great Lie, classic and recent appraisals of totalitarianism, and The Long Night of the Watchman, the collected essays of Václav Benda. And Flagg has done a lot of work on Czech dissidents and the question of totalitarianism, so I think you're going to enjoy this interview. Today we're going to discuss the work of Václav Havel and also his idea of dissent as living in truth. So for Havel, dissent is not primarily a political act, but really an existential dissent from ideology, from the politicization of life, from false narratives, and from consumerism. And so we discuss a number of his essays, including a letter to Dr. Husak, his very famous essay, Power of the Powerless, Stories in Totalitarianism, and a little bit of his plays, including The Audience. And so I think Havel's a very inspirational figure. I mean, he's writing in the 70s and 80s during the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakian communism. And so it would seem that maybe he's not relevant to our life, but I think he is because he talks about this importance of self-awareness and how to avoid these ideological categories and thinking ideologically. And so we see this all over the right, all over the left. And so this idea of dissenting from ideological categories. And it's not just a political act, as I said. Sometimes it's just sitting by the fire and reading good books, playing good music together, singing together. And we see this with Václav Benda's family. When he was in prison, they sat together and read Lord of the Rings. That was part of their dissent. John Paul II, part of his dissent under the Nazi invasion of Poland, I mean, he worked to help Jews escape, but he also was part of a theater. And so we talk about why theater matters and why these little acts of dissent. We also talk about the difference between state-planned events and authentic liturgical worship, and compare some of the work of Havel with Joseph Pieper and his book In Tune with the World and Only the Lover Sings. So thank you again for listening. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Please, again, as always, if you like the podcast, please take time to do a review. That really helps. Also, I have a Patreon set up. So thanks to my patron out there who supported it. You can go to the website, themoralimagination.com, and there's a link to the Patreon there. So that helps pay for all the editing and all the other things around it. Also, all the show notes, as always, are on the Moral Imagination website at www.themoralimagination.com. So thank you again for listening. Please feel free to contact me and give me any suggestions of guests or topics. And I hope you enjoy my podcast interview with Flagg Taylor on the work of Václav Havel. So Flagg, thank you very much for joining the Moral Imagination Podcast.
Oh, Michael, I'm happy to be here. Excited to talk about Václav Havel with you.
Great. So I actually heard about your work from the great Dan Mahoney. So thanks to Dan for the introduction. And we're going to talk today about Václav Havel, but you also are an expert on Václav Benda and written a number of things, including a collection of his work called The Long Night of the Watchman. So why don't I ask to start with two questions. Why do you think Václav Havel is so important? And then what drew you to the work of the Czech dissidents like Havel and Benda and others?
Well, I'll start with the second question first. I started teaching a course at Skidmore, I think it must have been in 2005, called Dissident Political Thought. Dan Mahoney had got me interested in the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz and Solzhenitsyn and Hovel and others. And so I started teaching some of these texts, and I did a lot of photocopying and created lots of course readers because there was no one place that one could go to find essays around the theme of totalitarianism and dissent. And so in 2011, I published an anthology as a result of teaching that course for over the couple of years called The Great Lie. And it's just kind of a greatest hits of anti-totalitarian writing. And then right around that time, I ended up going to Prague and Vienna with my wife, just for fun, and then discovered that there was a little research money available that would help me support the trip. Had another friend that Mahoney and I know well named Jim Pontuso, wrote a book on Havel. Spent a couple years, I think, on a Fulbright in Prague, and so he was able to connect me with some of the dissidents, and did a couple of interviews, not with any particular thing in mind, but just thought it would be interesting to talk to them. And the more people I talked to, the more I just got kind of drawn into this amazing world and was just struck over and over by their courage, kind of the depth of their reflection about, trying to think through the conditions that they lived in prior to 1989 under communism. And so I decided I would try to write a book about Czech political thought, Czech political philosophy in the 70s and 80s. Still working on that. And then in the course of that work, ended up becoming friendly with Mrs. Bendova, the late Václav Benda's wife, and realized that his work, though very important in Czech circles, much of it was not translated into English, and found a translator and worked for a few years to bring out Benda's writing in English. So it just originally started as kind of my own interest in teaching and thinking about Solzhenitsyn and Havel and others, and then having this kind of lucky trip to Prague and being introduced to some of these people, and it's sort of spiraled from there.
Oh, that's great. I have a question. Maybe I'm getting this wrong. I think I've read somewhere. Is it Benda who he had 5 or 6 children?
He did. He had six children.
6 children. Was he was in prison for a bit, right?
He was. Yeah. At the same time as Havel, he was put on trial in 1979 and found guilty, I think, of subversion of the Republic because of his activities in an organization called VONS, which is a kind of sister organization to Charter 77. The Czech acronym means something like Committee to Defend the Unjustly Persecuted. And so he and Havel were in prison from 79 to 83. Havel got released sooner than Benda for health reasons. But if memory serves, I think they were both given a 4-year sentence. Benda served the whole of his sentence, but Havel was released a little early because of his health.
Okay, so I think I've already asked you to come back to talk about Benda. So this is just podcast 1 with Flagg Taylor. We're going to have him back to talk about Benda. But I think maybe it was like an essay or something. Maybe it was Rod Dreher essay. I'm trying to remember. But I think if this is the connection, but I didn't make it until right now. I think this is that Mrs. Benda, didn't she tell stories about like reading The Lord of the Rings quietly with her 6 children?
Yeah.
Okay. That image, Flagg, has been in I didn't make it till right now as you were talking about that. I'm like, wait a minute. That's the story when you said Mrs. Benda. That image really sticks with me. I think about it all the time of just like, and we'll talk about this actually in the podcast of like, what does dissent look like? And Havel writes about this in Power to the Powerless, that sometimes dissent is the everyday dissent of quietly reading The Lord of the Rings in a totalitarian place while your husband is in prison and you're caring for your 6 children. It's very powerful, that story.
Yeah. I talked to Rod for, he must have interviewed me when he was working on the Benedict option book, because that's when he first, I think in the course of thinking about the Benedict option, he discovered Havel and Benda, and we talked.
Okay.
So,
yeah. That's a powerful. So we'll talk about Benda next time, but let's talk about Havel. And why don't you go maybe just do 2 things. One is you talked about why you got interested and how you got interested, but why is Havel relevant to us today? Because in one sense, right, you read Havel, like the letter to Husak, is that correct pronunciation?
Mm-hmm,
Dr. Husak. You read various things, and it's very much kind of contextualized within the Czech time that he's writing. So you have to kind of almost look at the footnotes. So who is he talking about? What's he talking about? But in another sense, they're very powerful human pieces that speak to everybody outside of that specific time or situation. Why do you think Havel is so important for us today? Why is he worth reading instead of just kind of, or is it just historical interest? Like, oh, you're interested in Czechoslovakia or in that period or Czech culture, but I think you think it's bigger than that. Why?
Yeah, there's probably a bunch of reasons. I mean, the first is that I think people misunderstand the totalitarian phenomenon and kind of what the Cold War was about, right? The kind of bumper sticker thinking on that is that it was a battle of these 2 economic systems, capitalism versus socialism, and capitalism wins because capitalist economics is rooted in reality, while socialist economics is not, and that's sort of the beginning and the end of it. But I think Havel's important in a similar way to why Solzhenitsyn and others are important is because that they help you understand that the nature of totalitarianism, the nature of communism, is I guess much more deeply problematic than just kind of misbegotten economics and planning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That it's an assault on the human person, that it's ideological, and Havel uses that phrase in Power of the Powerless and other places. He wants you to understand that ideological thinking is thinking that is completely divorced from reality, and they're trying to create a new human being by altering social and political conditions. And it results in this systematic, coercive, lying structure, which is very hard for people in the West who hadn't experienced the phenomenon to grasp. That's another reason I think Havel is important. He actually says, I think it's in Stories in Totalitarianism, and the great French Sovietologist, Russianist, a guy named Alain Besançon, says something similar, that it's just very difficult for outsiders to appreciate the totalitarian phenomenon because it's so alien to their experience. This kind of systematic assault on reality. It's not something that people can appreciate, and so you really have to be kind of launched into it, or you have to read someone who has kind of a literary talent to communicate this deep, experiential, existential kind of violation. And so I think Havel can help people appreciate the nature of something that's just very difficult to get at if you haven't experienced it.
Mm-hmm. And also it's interesting because both he and Solzhenitsyn do tend to say the West needs to pay attention to this. And I think one reason I think they say that is the first part of your answer, which is I think there's an error, as you say, that somehow we've reduced socialism to an economic system. But economics is part of a communist socialist system. And it's part because it's materialist. But it's not simply that in any way, shape, or form. It's a much broader cultural and really an anthropological worldview of creating new men and new women. And so it's a new kind of person. So I think that's important. But I also think, and maybe you can comment on this just briefly, is both of them say, like, the West needs to pay attention to this. Solzhenitsyn says that. And I think it's actually at the end of Power of the Powerless, he says, the West has to pay attention to what's happening today.
Yeah, both Solzhenitsyn and Havel think that there's kind of a broader disease, afflicting the communist West and liberal, or communist East rather, and liberal West. Havel calls it kind of modern technological civilization. Solzhenitsyn usually uses the term anthropocentrism. So they both think that there's a certain kind of materialism that is at work in both you might say the unfree East, but the free West. And so if the West doesn't watch out, it's going to kind of succumb to its worst instincts and be unfree, maybe in a different way, but in a equally profound way as the communist East.
I think there's two things. I actually have a podcast coming out soon, or maybe it'll come out after this. But anyway, it's coming out. I did the interview with Dr. David Devil on his book, Solzhenitsyn and American Culture, which is an edited book. And we talk about actually Solzhenitsyn on that. And I interviewed Carlo Lancialotti for this podcast. It came out 2020 on the Italian philosopher Augusto Del Noce, who makes the same worries, that he actually says the Marxism realized itself in the West, that in fact we haven't appropriated some of these ideas and that they're kind of seeping their way through. And so I think that's another reason just to pay attention. Even though we have freedom, I think we're not, Havel has something to say to us. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, just one more answer to why Havel matters. And I think you find this theme in his plays most dramatically, but he alludes to it in some of his essays and also in his letters to Olga, which is a book that sort of collected letters that he wrote to his wife when he was in prison, but they really weren't only written to his wife. They were written to his brother and his brother's circle of friends. So they're in a way philosophic essays more than they are really just letters to his wife. He talks about the experience of absurdity. And the experience of absurdity is the experience of the absence of meaning where meaning should exist. And I think that's something that certainly we in the West can appreciate, and why some of his plays resonate today too, is that people have experience of a kind of hyper bureaucratic world often in their employment, and and they get a sense of the kind of absurdity that Havel's talking about with communism, even though they haven't experienced communism directly. They understand what a kind of hyper bureaucratic world that doesn't allow them to kind of use their reason and judgment, and so they can appreciate Havel's points in the plays in surprising ways.
Yeah, and I think, and probably you combine that hyper bureaucratic element in some work. Also with consumerism, right, which he talks about. And so hopefully we can talk about consumerism. Because I think some people make the mistake of thinking consumerism is simply a capitalist phenomenon. But you have this consumerist ethos in socialism as well. And I think, and then it's a kind of like damaging to the human spirit, as it were. And I think we also see just even increasing both hyper bureaucracy, but also like speech codes in corporations or schools, or what you're not allowed to say certain things. And so, I talked about this in another podcast, so I won't go to it, but I could sometimes even something very simple, like, at this business, we're a family. Like, no one actually believes we're a family. Nobody acts like we're a family. So right. I think there's a lot of problems for that, which I've talked about other times, so I won't go into it. But even little things like that. And we can talk about bigger speech codes where there's kind of political correctness, but just even little things that are just everybody knows is not true. But if you say, well, that's just not true, then you're just a curmudgeon, you're negative, So I think there's even in little ways. And again, I think both of us are saying right here, to be really clear, just in case anybody's misunderstanding, I am not, I know you are not in any way comparing the little difficulties of a speech code or something with what Havel and hundreds of millions of people had to go through Soviet and the Soviet bloc totalitarianism. That's not what we're saying, right? What we're talking about is just why even some of the experiences there we can see here, and that's why Havel's relevant, right?
Yeah, that's good. I think that's a good cautionary note.
Yeah, I mean, there's just absolutely radical evil with tens and tens of millions of people dead and families broken apart and jailed. And so I want to make sure that, I think sometimes I talk about the forest and the trees. We lose the forest for the trees, and you need to pay attention to the trees, but you can't forget the forest, and vice versa. So I think we keep that in mind. But yeah, I think that, that consumerism too is interesting, like the bureaucracy. So, all right, so let's do this. Before we go into some of his essays, we're going to talk about a couple of his works. We're going to talk about his letter to Dr. Husak.
Yep.
We're going to talk about an essay called Power of the Powerless, which is really probably his most famous essay. And then another one called Stories in Totalitarianism. And we're going to talk about at least one of his plays, The Audience, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about the memorandum. I'm not getting paid for this right here, but there is a very good interview with Flagg by John Miller on the Great Books podcast on the memorandum that I recommend to listeners go listen to. And I will put links to these books on my website at themoralimagination.com. So that last part was an ad.
I'll give you my Venmo name, and you can deposit the money right after.
Okay. And John Miller, he'll have to send me something too. All right. So it'll just be a whole movement. All right. So anyway, before we do that, let's just briefly give, let's say there's a listener that doesn't know anything about Havel. Who's this guy? I mean, who is he? He's a playwright who becomes the president. So give a quick overview of who he is and his role there, and then what happened to him.
Yeah, he's Vaclav Havel was born in 1936 to a pretty wealthy family in Prague. His uncle Miloš had been a kind of prominent film magnate, and so he was not, when the communists came to power in a coup in 1948. And then Czechoslovakia, Václav was not allowed to study because he had this bourgeois background. The communists were very careful about who they wanted to elevate in the society that they were building. So if you had any connection to a bourgeois background, middle class, shop owner, that sort of thing, you were prevented from studying and advancing. In the 60s, he took a job as a stagehand at a theater, and that's how he really started becoming interested in the theater and started writing plays. The mid 60s was a sort of the time of a partial thaw in Czechoslovakia, and so the censorship laws were weakened, and so some of his plays were actually able to be produced and staged in Prague, and that gained him an international reputation pretty quickly, and he started to make some money from his plays being produced and staged abroad in theaters in Berlin and Vienna and London and even in New York City. And then in the 1970s, after the crackdown in 1968, the Prague Spring, when the Soviets and the other Warsaw Pact countries sent in their military forces to crush the reform movement within the Czechoslovak Communist Party, this was the period of normalization, and Havel started to think and write and become more active in thinking about how he might resist the communist order. And so this is the period when he wrote the letter to Husak in 1975, and then Power the Powerless in 78. He started to become more active and founded with a bunch of his friends Charter 77, which was a dissident organization kind of founded to hold the regime at minimum to abiding by its own laws as far as human rights were concerned, because of the Helsinki Accords. The Communist bloc was obliged to incorporate the human rights guarantees in the Helsinki Accords into their own domestic constitutions. And so they kind of used that to call the regime to account when it imprisoned people for no reason or violated freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, things like this. And then in the late 80s, when things started to happen in Hungary and Poland and East Germany, Havel became more and more involved in thinking about what a transition from communism to the democratic world would look like, and was at the center of an organization called the Civic Forum, and as you mentioned, was made the first president of Czechoslovakia after 1989, and then when Slovakia and the Czech Republic split, he was made the first president of the free Czech Republic. So it's an amazing story. I don't think Havel had a kind of political life in mind for himself at all. I think he would have probably been perfectly happy writing plays and being an artist in normal times, but he didn't live in normal times, and so he found a way to rise to become president of his country.
Okay, good. No, that's really helpful. I think gives a good picture as we go forward. So let's start then with that first letter that you mentioned, the letter to Dr. Husak. Why don't you give some context about it? And it's an important letter. So it's 1975, right?
1975, yeah. So as I mentioned, this was the period that the Czechoslovak communists themselves called the period of normalization. And what they meant by that was they wanted to return, to the orthodox communism after this brief experimentation that ended in the Prague Spring. And so they did what they referred to as normalized society, and I think that by 1975 they were pretty happy with what they had done. They thought that they had kind of imprisoned most of the troublemakers or induced them to emigrate. Lots of people emigrated in the aftermath of the Prague Spring in the late 60s, early 70s, and so the party's kind of looking around, and I think being somewhat satisfied with its with the kind of order that they had introduced. And so Havel says in, I think it's in his autobiography, by 1975, he says he was kind of tired of being tired. And he felt like he was always playing defense, right? And so this gave him the idea of writing this letter to Husak, the general secretary of the Communist Party, and basically saying to the president that what you think is a kind of peaceful, pacified, satisfied society is actually not. It's people are passive and they're not satisfied, but they're basically they've been crushed, and they live in fear, and they've been their hopes and ability to kind of navigate their own lives has been crushed at every turn. And so what looks like order and satisfaction is really fear and passivity and just a quiet society, but a society that exists in this stasis because of the level of unfreedom and fear that's been unleashed by the party. It's a totally unpoliticized. Czechs have this habit of going to that lots of Czechs have these little kind of country houses in the mountains. And so, Havel makes reference to the fact that people go to their country house and don't think about politics. In a way, it seems like they're happy not to think about it, and so they're kind of completely privatized. And he just wants to announce to Husak that the party shouldn't feel good about itself.
He says, well, a couple of things. He says, this is not in order, but this is later or kind of halfway through the letter. So the text I'm using right here, so if listeners get this, and again, there's a link on my website. So there's my ad. It's Open Letters, Selected Writings of Vaclav Havel, 1965 to 1990. And so this is on page 62. But he says, quote, order has been established at the price of a paralysis of the spirit, a deadening of the heart, and the devastation of life. Surface, quote, consolidation, end quote, has been achieved at the price of a spiritual and moral crisis in society. Unfortunately, the worst feature of this crisis is that it keeps deepening. We only need to raise our size a little above our limited daily perspective in order to realize with horror how hastily we are abandoning positions which only yesterday we refused to desert. What social consequence only yesterday regarded as improper is today casually excused. Tomorrow it will be thought natural, and the day after that held up as a model of behavior. What we declared impossible yesterday, or at least averred we would never get accustomed to, today we accept without astonishment as a fact of life. And he goes on. And this is, I think, one point there is this desensitization to evil, right? I mean, that's not only in totalitarianism. I think we see that in our contemporary society, like things that were radical 10, 20, 30 years ago are just normal today. Things that you would not see on television are everywhere. Things that children should not be exposed to are now, they're just normal. And I think so that's I think, goes outside of Czech experience. But then back to the fear question, he does say that why are people behaving the way they do? And this is right in the beginning of the letter. As you said, it's fear. Fear of losing his job. The school teacher teaches things he does not believe. Fear for his future. The pupil repeats them after him. For fear of not being allowed to continue his studies, the young man joins the youth league and participates in whatever activities are necessary. Fear that under the monstrous system of political credits, his son or daughter will not acquire the necessary total points for enrollment leads the father to take on a manner of voluntary things, right? And so people are basically doing these things that seem to be good and seem to be kind of, everybody's normal and happy. And they're not a fear of torture, he says so much. I mean, yes, those things had happened. They're not happening at this point and that much, but it's existential pressure.
Yeah.
Could you develop that a little bit?
Yeah. So he's there. What he does is develop a distinction that he elaborates on in Stories in Totalitarianism. But the difference between this normalization period of the 70s and 80s and the 1950s, for example, is pretty stark, right? The 1950s was a time when people were tortured, when people were sent to labor camps to work in uranium mines, right? And you had this, on the one hand, especially in the early 50s, I think genuine attachment to, belief in, enthusiasm for communist ideals and kind of bloody repression against dissenters. All that is gone in the normalization era, right? There aren't any true believers anymore. And so the necessity for kind of violent repression has gone away. But people, Havel finds, are just as kind of conformist, as they were in the 50s, and the punishments, have decreased in degree. And so the party doesn't have to do, the dramatic uranium mine 10-year sentences that they had to do in the 50s. It turns out that people now can be made to comply with the party's dictates by, the threatening of, your child won't get to go to the school that you want them to go to, and people have just kind of become habituated to adapting themselves to this fictional reality that the party is put out there. And Havel is, I think, just struck by the extent to which that outward adaptation, as you alluded to, has become kind of habitual. People don't really think twice about it, and so it's almost like if you think in terms of people are kind of inhabiting roles when they go out in public to conform. They're becoming actors. It's almost like Havel is suggesting people have lost the ability to distinguish between kind of their true selves and then the role that they play, to stay out of trouble. That those two beings, those two persons, have somehow merged, and people don't even remember, how to be true to themselves anymore.
Yeah, that's interesting because he says this absolutely helps shed light on the example that he gives in Stories in Totalitarianism when he says, it's kind of like he said, look, nobody writes about anything. There are no reporters here in Czechoslovakia. He said, because nothing's happening here. He said, there are reporters in Lebanon. He said, why? Because everybody here just has asthma. We're just kind of slowly dying from suffocation. And so in a sense, like there's not a story to tell because humanity is being kind of pushed down. And I think there's an interesting actually parallel. And again, maybe disagree with this, but when I read a couple different points through reading Hovel, I think of Alexis de Tocqueville when he talks about soft despotism. And he talks about the enervating, how all the rules and regulations enervate people. So it's not so much that it oppresses them, it stops them from acting. And I think that's the soft despotism. This is a harder despotism, to be sure. But there's that when he's writing in 75, as you said, it's not sending to the gulags or the camps for 10 years, but it's preventing people from acting. And so slowly but surely, everyone has asthma and is suffocating.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I like the parallel to Tocqueville, and he makes the point too that paradoxically he says indifference and apathy can become active social forces.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If everyone is apathetic, if everyone is indifferent, that can't help but kind of create a tone in society at large, right? And so that that tone ends up looking like a consolidated satisfaction, but it's, as he says, it's not. It's the result of the presence of the party and the presence of the dominance of the ideology.
Yeah, he says there's this, and he talks about this again in Power to the Powerless, which we'll talk about, but that the ideology has nothing to do with reality, and so it's in fact a re-articulation of reality, so that theory describes reality, not vice versa, and that everyone has to accept these things. And he gives this example, and maybe this is wrong, but he says this line, far more suitable to the real interest. This is from Dr. Husak letter. Far more suitable to the real interests of the authorities today is what I've called the aesthetics of banality, which misses the truth much more inconspicuously, acceptably and plausibly, since it's far more digestible for the conventional mind. It's far more suited to the role accorded to culture in the consumer philosophy, not to excite people with truth, but to reassure them with lies.
Yeah, that's a striking line. And I think that's the connection between the Husak letter and the Power of the Powerless. And this, I think these two essays together really help people understand ideology in the sense in which, Havel wants you to understand it, that it's this, as you put it, this kind of hyper theoretical intervention on reality. The ideology is not built from thinking about the world as it is. The ideology is kind of built in the abstract, and this is how we wish the world to be. And then we're going to apply that reality. We're going to apply this fictive reality, this ideology onto society, and that is what people have to adapt themselves to. And so they become, I guess, less and less able to grasp reality as it exists, right? They become more and more habituated to using the ideological categories, to thinking about reality in the way that the party wants them to think about it. And that's just, something that people in the West weren't ready to grasp, and I think that's why Havel's essays are so important. But I think now, right, with
not just, I'd say it's much more like that. What you just said. Sorry to interrupt here, but what you just said about like the ideological categories, thinking in ideological categories. I mean, this I think is increasingly prevalent in the West, around right and left. It's
I agree. Yeah. That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, develop that out.
No, just. I mean, I wasn't going to say more than that. That I think. I don't know, 20, 25 years ago, people in the West, would have had a harder time looking around in their own lives for things that could smack as similar to that. But I think now it seems both on the kind of progressive left and the kind of Trumpian populist right, you have people thinking ideologically in ways that just aren't connected to reality. So I think it's pretty frightening, frankly, that this is becoming more and more of a problem today.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's and I think there's a lot of reasons for it. I think one, I talk about this a bit here on this podcast, is I think we just live in an ideological age, and so we live in the age of Marx, Darwin, of Freud, of materialism, right through the 20th century, now in the 21st. It's competing ideologies, and it seems like there's a tendency. And so I'm Catholic. I've talked about this on the podcast. I'm Catholic. I see in Catholics like, well, what's our theory of everything? We don't have a theory of everything. That's not the promise. No, there's not a theory of everything. And I don't just mean like physics. I just mean like even like how to think about politics. There's a sense that we have to have ideological categories to explain absolutely everything that goes on. I think there's also a tendency more towards conspiracy theories. This is a second point. Point two, everybody's looking for kind of and I think the conspiracy theory element is let me say this. When crises happen, right, there are always bad actors who are looking to consolidate power and financial gain. Okay, so that's given. But the conspiracy element, I think, is actually related to, it's like correct me if you think I'm wrong. I'm just thinking of this out loud a little bit, but it's like a corollary to the ideological nature, because everything has to be kind of a closed system. And so I think we're just becoming increasingly ideological and less philosophical, where we say, okay, let's wrestle with the real complex nature of reality in some type of reverence before being. And then we'll try to understand, like St. Thomas says, conforming our mind. Truth is the conforming of the mind to reality, but the ideologue is conforming reality to the mind. And it seems like, I don't know, maybe you have some thoughts, but I think you're right. There's just, you see it on the right and the left, conspiracy theories, everything. There's just we're increasingly ideological. And I would agree with you. It's frightening.
Yeah, I would have a hard time improving on what you just said. I guess it's tricky though, right? Because it's not exactly right that people have ideologies, in the sense that the party in Czechoslovakia had one, that it was this comprehensive theory of reality that was, literally supposed to explain everything about the human world and how the human world would become better, right, because of the party's actions. That's sort of this rigorously comprehensive and rigorously logical. Hannah Arendt has an essay where she talks about what she thinks an ideology is, and she mentions its comprehensiveness, but she also mentions its inner logicality, right? That in the Leninist Marxist system, if A, then B, then C, and you can't think your way outside of that ABC relationship, at all. Once you grant the first premise, then the next seven things must follow. So it's not. I think what's interesting is it's not like people have ideologies in that sense, but they are, as you suggested, kind of hyper theoretical in their, I guess, in their attempts to kind of grasp the way the world works. They start with abstractions instead of starting with particulars. And so I think your contrast between kind of ideological thinking and kind of an openness to thinking about the world in a philosophical sense is well taken.
Well, let's move then through this letter, because I think let's shift direction a little bit here, because I think there's I think we're seeing right now, just in the discussion, why Havel's so relevant today. Just because he makes you think, he makes you ask these questions and wrestle with them, and maybe there's not a perfect answer, and it's not a perfect correlation, but I think there's just a lot. He makes you think a lot. So I would like to talk about at least two other things in this letter before moving on, and so one of them is, I think it's in this one, right, where he talks about the importance of like channels of communication and culture, and that this culture, he says, the overall question is this. I'm kind of going to go to the end. What profound intellectual and moral impotence will the nation suffer tomorrow following the castration of its culture today? That the culture is also being desiccated or destroyed by this kind of it's hard to think this through, to articulate this requirement to obey the ideology of the party. And so he's saying to Dr. Husak, you think there's peace, but there's not. And we're paying a high price for this. And one of the prices we're paying is the destruction of culture. So why don't you talk a little bit about culture and how his work on why cultural journals are important and other things.
Yeah, this is the striking thing about the essay, that it kind of splits neatly in two parts. In part one, he talks about what we've already discussed, right? That this existential fear and apathy and indifference has become an active social force, such that people are kind of beaten down and they've become normalized, I guess, in the way that the party wants them to. So they just behave in utterly predictable ways. And then the second half of the essay, he turns in what seems like kind of a strange direction. I think maybe you can tell me, when you first read it, you're sort of getting this broad picture of this world that Havel's living in, and then all of a sudden he's talking about some obscure theater journal, and it's a little jarring.
Mm-hmm.
But I think
and you can get to think, oh, this is not relevant, or it's just super it's very relevant to the time. It just kind of, he jumps into that thing like, okay, it's why, and almost like, why is this in the open letters, right? But then it does mean something, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think so what on reflection, what the point that he's making, I think that connects these two parts of the essay, he discusses the importance of a society having a kind of self-knowledge, right? People have to have ways in their own society of thinking about the meaning of their lives in a broad sense. And so if the party is the center of power and it's the center of the ideology, and there's this one ideological truth that dominates, and it stamps out every attempt for people in the world to understand themselves through their own efforts, right? People won't think about. I think this is the danger, is that people won't think about meaning at all. And so Havel wants to say, look, it matters that the party doesn't allow an insignificant theater journal, to exist, because this is just one small effort by people in a society to come to their own judgment about what matters and kind of what's happening in their own lives, and to tell particular stories about people who are important or who are doing something particularly useful. And so what seems crazy at first blush, he's just saying, look, all this cultural knowledge that's created and transmitted by these journals that probably have a very insignificant circulation, if you kind of take these journals in total, this is how a society comes to know itself. It's how it transmits, meaning from one generation to the next generation. And so I think he just wants people to notice that the party wants you to think, well, it doesn't really matter if we censor this one minor journal. But I think he wants people to notice that it's all of a piece, and that they should be pissed off when one minor theater journal gets canceled,
Or the plastic people of the universe.
Or the plastic people, the rock band, right? These hippies that want to play pretty terrible, Frank Zappa-like, in my judgment, music. It matters that they're not allowed to do that. And so, people, I think, might be tempted by the people in the party, or even the people who aren't in the party but are just kind of want to go along to get along. Look, you should be angry by these things that seem minor, but you gotta think about it holistically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I was going to ask this later, but I'll say it now. It's interesting. At the end of the essay, he says he's talking about a couple of things that this isn't going to work in the long run. You think you've created this type of peace. You think by you have normal social life because people go to their little, what they call it, dacha in Russian, I don't know, to their cottages. But he says, even if, this is a couple points, he says, on the contrary, this is page 78 in this edition, even if they never speak of it, people have a very cute appreciation of the price they've paid for outward peace and quiet, the permanent humiliation of their human dignity. The less direct resistance they put up, comforting themselves by driving it from their mind and deceiving themselves with the thought that it's no account, or else simply gritting their teeth, the deeper the experience etches itself into their emotional memory. The man who can resist humiliation can quickly forget it, but the man who can long tolerate it, must long remember it. In actual fact, then, nothing remains forgotten. All the fear one has endured, all the dissimulation has been forced into, all the painful and degrading buffoonery, and worst of all, perhaps, the feeling of having displayed one's cowardice, all of this settles and accumulates somewhere in the bottom of our social consciousness, quietly fermenting. He says, this is no healthy situation. And then at the end, he says, you've chosen the easy way out for yourselves, and the most dangerous road for society and the path of inner decay, just for the sake of outward appearances and deadening of life. Increasing uniformity, everything looks fine. Everybody has to obey these rules, but really, this is really dangerous, and not just dangerous politically, but dangerous for the human soul. What do you say to that?
Yeah, that's interesting. When you were reading that quotation, it made me think there's a kind of deep connection between this essay and the Power of the Powerless.
Yeah, the grocer, right? The Green Grocer.
Yeah. So, I'll just mention what you just alluded to. The very famous image that Hovel uses in the Power of the Powerless is the Green Grocer who every day when he goes to work, he enters a shop and he puts a sign up in the shop window that says, "Workers of the world unite." And Hovel says, now, does this Green Grocer actually believe that the workers of the world are united, are going to unite? Does he believe in any sense sort of the content of the ideology? And he says, no, he does it because he wants to be left alone. And it's just part of this general ideological panorama that is created. But people are willing to do it because they want to live a peaceful, quiet life. And so what you just alluded to with the Husak quotation, right, is that even though people put up the sign, they never really are able to part with the sense that they're doing something that is violating their dignity. Now, what's interesting, so sort of laying that on the table, what's interesting, I think, to think about in Hovel when you read these essays is this really true? Is he being merely descriptive, or is he kind of writing this essay and saying this in a way to prod people that they should feel violated, right? Because he's very open in the Power and Powerless essay about the fact I was just trying to, as you were talking, I was paging through the essay trying to find the quotation. Of course, I couldn't, but he says something like, people are the ideology is dominant in a way because people are capable of living a lie, right? Human nature is such that people are capable of living a lie. And so society has, in fact, been demoralized to a certain extent. And so I think what Hovel is doing in this essay with the quote you just alluded to, the Husak essay in Power of the Powerless, in a way is acknowledging the extent to which people have become demoralized and spiritually violated, and trying to prod them to I guess become angrier than he thinks they are, right? It's so in a way he's not always perfectly honest. I think he's sort of this I mean this puts it negatively, but it's sort of wishful thinking. It's when he's talking about people feeling violated and their dignity being taken away in the quotation you just read. I think he's sort of wishing that people felt that more powerfully, and I think he's hoping that through his writing and through the efforts of these essays, circulating, that people will become, I guess, more and more in touch with the fact that their dignity has been taken from them.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think and I think again, I keep saying this, but that's why it's relevant today, because we have to be attention to what do I just kind of start to accept? And there's two things that come out that made me think about it. I'm actually now in Power of the Powerless. One, he says, ideology is a specious way of relating to the world.
Yep.
It offers human beings the illusion of identity, of dignity, and of morality, while making it easier for them to part with them. Right, which is I think interesting, because you're saying, I think that's a good point. He's both being descriptive, and we know this because he describes all the dissidents at the end of Power of the Powerless, who are just regular people, who what he calls this beautiful, I think it's living within the truth, which is fantastic. We'll talk about that more, but such a inspirational element, and also, like, by the way, reflects the Gospel of John too. Which I think is striking, this idea of living in the truth, and living truth. But then he says, this is later in Power of the Powerless, part of the essence of and he says post-totalitarianism, which, just for listeners, he doesn't mean that they're not in totalitarianism. He means it's kind of maybe late totalitarianism, right? Rather than not after totalitarianism. It's a kind of late totalitarian society, is that it draws everyone into its sphere of power, not so they may realize themselves as human beings, but so they may surrender their human identity in favor of the identity of the system. So they become agents of the system's general automism and service of its self-determined goals. And he says, and the Green Grocer and the Prime Minister are all in the system. One has more power than the other, but they're all basically cogs of the system. And so it's interesting that maybe you're right, that he's not simply describing what some people are feeling. He's prodding other people, say, do you know what you're doing? Do you know what you're doing? And one other thing that struck me about your argument that he's prodding is when he says, let's take note, this is quote, if the Green Grocer had been instructed to display the slogan, quote, I am afraid and therefore unquestionably obedient, end quote, he would not be nearly as indifferent to its semantics, even though the statement would reflect the truth.
That's right.
That's that's actually, I think, that's the prodding element, right? Do you know what your slogan really says, don't you? It just says you're afraid.
That's right.
And that's saying you need to man up, or you need to, become awake in a sense, right? You need to wake up to what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I would just say too, this is why these essays and Hovel in general has such relevance to today, right? Because if you think about people who inhabit a corporation or a university, right, the way to get promoted or the way to get a little bonus, right, is to go along with the kind of general social justice-y, language that the higher ups want you to use, and you'll just have an easier, more lucrative, quiet career, right? And so why would you, if someone wants you to put up a sign outside your office door that signals that you're friendly to Black Lives Matter, right? I mean, if that's going to be what's needed for you to get a little bonus in pay, or people will kind of leave you alone at work, most people aren't going to think twice about it. Sure, I'll just put that thing up. And so I think Havel, as you just said, he's trying to prod people to remember what they're being asked to part with when they make these seemingly insignificant acts. It's they're trying to guarantee themselves a kind of quiet, decent life. And if the alternative is kind of unknown in terms of the punishments, it makes perfect logical sense why people would put up these signs.
Right. I think, yeah, maybe let's continue there on this point, because I think and I want to go back to this one question in Dr. Husak on the difference between state events and liturgy. But let's continue where we are, because I think he makes this point. I'm trying to find it here, where he talks about, as you just said, why are we hanging up the sign? And as you said, he doesn't really believe this. He wants to be left alone. And what's interesting about this that Havel points out is that, what if he didn't put up the sign? Now, no one notices when the lady goes into the store. She doesn't notice, because she probably put up the sign in her office. She's not paying attention. Workers of the world unite. But if he didn't have the sign up, then he would be, in a sense, resisting. And I think you see this, for example, you gave the example of Black Lives Matter, or with like pride flags or whatever. I was walking by this store event project, and I noticed there's the kind of pride flag, and I thought, that's interesting. Like, what is that connected to anything? And I realized, well, if you didn't have it, you might get hassled. If I went to the University of Notre Dame, and the other day I was watching a Notre Dame football game, and at the ad, they had this ad about Notre Dame and et cetera. And it's very interesting. They're talking about all that Notre Dame does. And all of a sudden, like, somebody with a BLM shirt came in. Now, this is too complex to talk about what Black Lives Matter is and et cetera. But it's very interesting, because, there's multiple variations of it. So I don't want to get into that now. That maybe I can in fact, maybe I'll have Anthony Bradley come on. He's written a book on why Black Lives Matter. So he's been a guest before. I'll have him come back and talk about his new book, hopefully. But the point here is, so part of Black Lives Matter, at least I'm not sure at this release, I don't know, but part of it was a very clear kind of rejection of the nuclear family. It had certain elements of socialism where this present form of marriage has to be removed and destroyed. But Notre Dame is a Catholic university that ascribes to Catholic teaching, where the family is seen to be a reflection of the Trinity, right? It's a pre-political but natural community that has deep theological meaning to it. And so here, the University of Notre Dame puts out in his ad the sign, Black Lives Matter. Why? Well, does it believe it? I don't know. But it doesn't want to be, I think it's more like it doesn't want to be bothered. It wants to be left alone. And so it's a very interesting question, is why signs are put up. And I think this is just an important thing to think through, of how we, in a sense, give assent to positions, because it's just much easier to do so. I want to be left alone.
Right.
And but that ends up, according to Hovel, and maybe you can develop this, that ends up actually undermining us and undermining even what the words mean. They end up meaning nothing. They become kind of signs of this, the idea of virtue signaling, or maybe develop that in Hovel. This is like applying Hovel to today, and correct me if you think I'm missing something there.
No, I think that's right. I guess I would connect it to this was the word that the translator, Paul Wilson, uses. I off the top of my head, I don't remember the Czech word, but it's a very interesting English word, and it always strikes me when especially when someone else reads it out loud and I hear it. It's sort of different from when you read it quietly to yourself. But the word automatism, or
automatism, yeah,
but,
right.
But it's this, it's the idea that kind of, I don't know. I think he's suggesting that an ideologized society is a demoralized one, in that it makes questions of the good and judgments about the good not matter from the standpoint of particular human beings, right? The question of the good has been solved by the ideology. Mm-hmm. So the automatism is just sort of wraps you up in this fictive world where all you have to do is repeat slogans, but there's no personal necessity for you to kind of apprehend the good in a normal, rational way. And so that's what I think he thinks is so demoralizing about it. And the people kind of over the course of their daily life, in these minor ways, kind of part with their responsibility to navigate questions of the good. So I think that's what I guess his version of why virtue signaling is is bad, and it's sort of much more powerful and much more damaging, I guess, than what we normally mean by virtue signaling.
Right. Yeah. That it ends up undermining you.
Yeah.
Right. It undermines you because it undermines. And I think it also undermines even the questions of justice that need to be addressed. Right.
Right.
Because these things start. So it's like sometimes, for example, I mean, Workers of the World Unite didn't just pop out of nowhere, because we know there's exploitation of workers, right? Black Lives Matter didn't pop out of nowhere, because we know that there's racism and that there's murdering of Black people because of their skin color, right? So we know this, right? And we know that there's police abuse, et cetera. We know these things are true, right? They're not, and so these things, or I hope we know, they come out of something, but then in a sense they become sloganized. And they lose both their original connection to, say, Workers of the World Unite, and they also, in a sense, become like a slogan for the person who puts up the sign, who's just like, I just want to be left alone. Here's my sign.
Yeah, and they can. I guess I guess Havel's deeper point too is that they convince the people who put up the signs or who conform in these seemingly minor ways that their individual judgments don't matter.
Mm-hmm.
That they couldn't possibly come to a informed judgment about X or Y. They either have to do it through the lens of the party, or not do it at all. I think that's what Havel thinks is so. Yeah, that's destructive.
Yeah, two things that just struck me. So he, at one point, these are in Power of the Powerless, at different points, he says, to wandering humankind, it offers an immediately available home. All one has to do is accept it, and suddenly everything becomes clear once more. Life takes on new meaning, and all mysteries, unanswered questions, and anxieties and loneliness vanish. Of course, this is a great line. One pays dearly for this low-rent home. The price is abdication of one's own reason, conscience, and responsibility. For an essential aspect of this ideology is consignment of reason and conscience to a higher authority. The principle involved here is the center of power is identical with the center of truth.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think parting with one's own responsibility can feel good, right? You don't feel kind of sadness or anxiety at not being able to figure things out, right, in an easy way. And so I think he thinks the possibility of conforming is in some cases easy, and people don't mind that surrender.
I think, can I just say, to be, I think, important, and feel free to agree or disagree, but as we talk about this, we're giving examples of kind of progressive virtue signals, because I think those are the dominant ones that we deal with. But they're not the only dominant ones. There are right-wing things like this as well, right? Where you have to give some signal that that's your position, right?
Oh, sure.
And I think it's an abdication of one's own reason, conscience, and responsibility.
Mm-hmm. I guess, and the other thing I would say, I think we might as well connect this to the play audience that you mentioned at the outset. It's not only that Havel thinks people conform because of the kind of negative consequences of not conforming, but as Havel suggests in this play, is that there are often one can also be seduced into conforming because it seems like the decent thing to do. Right. So the play is about, and Havel himself worked at a brewery in the early 1970s. It's about this guy, Vaniek, who works at a brewery. The brewmaster invites Vaniek to have a little meeting in his office. And the kind of the punchline of the play is that the brewer has been asked to give reports on Vaniek to the STB, the Czech secret police, because he's a kind of known author, not really, we don't really know from the context of the play, but someone who's not purely conformist. And the bad news for the foreman, the brewmaster, is that as far as he's concerned, Vaniek doesn't do much of anything. There's nothing for him to put in these reports. And so he says to Vaniek, you're a writer. I know you write plays. Why don't you write these reports for me? You can write them in the most innocuous way you want. Whatever you want to write in there is fine, but then I'll give them to the secret police and look, this gets me out of a bind. It gets my friend who works for the STB. I forget his name, but this guy went to high school with them. He's a kind he's a kind of a decent guy, and so it sort of gets him in a bind, and everyone will be happy. And so in a way, that what the argument that the foreman is making, seems utterly sensible. Why not do a decent thing for this working class foreman at this warehouse who, he's not trying to oppress anyone.
Mm-hmm.
He's just trying to probably take care of his family and have a decent job. And so it doesn't really seem like he's asking Vaniek for much. And Vaniek won't do it. He decides he won't inform on himself. And this is going to create a real problem for the brewmaster, the foreman. And so I think Havel wants in that play, he really wants you to feel the weight of the fact that in a way, it does seem like the decent thing to do is just write this report on himself.
Right. But it's something he's not going to do it. Right. And there's this tension. Yeah. Why not? And so I think that's another thing that he comes through, that it's not, we gave some examples of the political questions, but I think even the band, the Plastic People of the Universe or whatever, the point was, this is not a big deal. They're not doing anything, but they're just, playing, music, and they're not allowed to do certain things. And but it also kind of seeps into all of our lives. And that, I think that's what you see in Dr. Husak, and also in a little interview he did called "It Always Makes Sense to Tell the Truth."
Mm-hmm.
Right? That you just have to tell the truth, or it starts to take over. And there are little ways in which we can adapt ourselves to the dominant ideology of whatever position we're in. So, like, if you and I share something, we'll just kind of we won't fight about it. We'll just kind of go agree. But oftentimes in that agreement, we're giving something of ourselves up, and we're hurting our soul. Right, we're deforming our moral judgments and our abilities. I think that's why I think one of the reasons I like Havel is, yes, I think it's related to the political times of day. Yes, I think it's important to understand totalitarianism, but I think it also is part of self-knowledge and self-examination. And as you said this, I think this is why people like his plays. This is why people like his writings, is that it makes you examine yourself.
Yeah. I think that's right, and I guess I would add one thing about the importance of the plays that bring out a theme that I guess isn't as strong in the essays, but that is that one kind of temptation that the dissident mindset has to wrestle with, right, is the temptation of self-righteousness,
mm-hmm.
right, and you sort of see that this character Vaniek. There's a couple more plays with Vaniek as the central character after this first one, Audience. It is easy for someone like this to become very self-satisfied and super judgmental about the failures of other people, and sort of to write off the rest of society as incapable of living in truth. And so I think Havel is in part writing these plays as an act of, as you suggested, kind of self-examination, that look, we got to watch out for our own self-righteousness here, and understand the particular circumstances that different people are in, and understand that what's easy for person A might not be so easy for person B, right, and sort of never get wrapped up in our own goodness,
mm-hmm.
right.
Right. No, I think that's right. I think it's easy to, I've done some podcasts on Girard here, and Girard has this concept of scapegoating, and so I've talked about this before, but we can often, in our critique of people for their activities, we can scapegoat them and thereby blind ourselves to our own guilt, which I think is this self-awareness. So let me say one last thing on this area, where I just think I found one more quote related to this about truth-telling, and I've said this before, that I sometimes think, we all think if we had to stand up against the Czech totalitarianism, I'd be a dissident. Absolutely. Right. And I laugh because maybe, think about the times when you're at work, I'm at work, or we're in different social setting or, type of thing. You don't tell the truth. I don't mean you necessarily outright lie. You just don't tell the truth. And not just being polite, You just kind of go along with something that you know is not true. But in order to say it's just too risky. Who knows? Maybe I'll lose my job. Maybe I'll just get demoted, or maybe just like uncomfortable. I won't be part of the inner circle. There's a wonderful essay by C.S. Lewis about the inner ring. I don't know if you've ever read it, but it's fantastic. I'll put a link to it on the notes page. But it's a little short essay of just how we want to be kind of in their inner circle. And so we end up slightly compromising ourselves and our deeper beliefs just to get in the inner circle. And I think that's something that is, I think you said this, really important. We have to put a check on our self-righteousness and actually examine ourselves clearly. So anyway, this quote from Hovel, Power of the Powerless, the beginning of section 9. He says, quote, "The profound crisis of human identity brought on by living within a lie, a crisis which in turn makes such a life possible, certainly possesses a moral dimension. It appears, among other things, as a deep moral crisis in society. A person who's been seduced by the consumer value system, which is a problem for us today, whose identity is dissolved in an amalgam of the accoutrements of mass civilization, and who has no roots in the order of being, no sense of responsibility for anything higher than his own personal survival, is a demoralized person. The system depends on this demoralization. In fact, it is a projection of it into society. And so the way you revolt against this is living within the truth." Well, I want to talk about living within the truth in a little bit more detail in a second, but I think this is another really, really powerful paragraph of Havel, because that doesn't have to be Czech totalitarianism. That's right now. We've been seduced by consumer value system, right? And amalgam of the accoutrements of mass civilization, and we have no roots in the order of being or sense of responsibility. I mean, that seems to describe modern America right now. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. He, this word consumerism. I mean, I think you can, people might think of that in a kind of narrow way. But you could also substitute something like materialism, right? Where people's sense of their own importance and value, they are defined solely by their material goods, the size of their house, their car is, or whatever. I mean, he had the second play in the Vanya trilogy is called The Unveiling, and Vanya goes to see two old friends of his, Michael and Vera, who are completely just dominated by consumerism, right? They have acquired all these things because it turns out Michael has a job that allows him to travel, and he can get record players and these sort of bizarre cultural artifacts, and their whole sense of self, their whole sense of who they are as people is defined by these material objects. And so Havel thinks that can happen in the communist East, and that can happen in the liberal West, and it's a temptation in both contexts, and so it's one that we can't think that we're not we don't have to worry about, right?
Right. Actually, that makes me think of an economic question I had for you. So I'll try to say this as succinctly as possible. It's complex, but we know. So there are cultural critiques of capitalism that are really they're enduring critiques of capitalism. I actually give a lecture every year at the Acton University on cultural critiques of capitalism. I've written about it. Again, I'll put a link up there. I support free competitive market economies. I think they're important for human flourishing and helping people get out of poverty and a lot of other things. And what those are it's complex, but it has to do with context, rule of law and private property, et cetera. So recognizing this is unnuanced, let me just move forward and say, but there are cultural critiques. I mean, does capitalism destroy culture or harm culture? And the answer is yes, of course it does. I mean, not, and no, it's like some things that you think are caused by capitalism are actually caused by other things. And I think it's an interesting point also just to talk about consumerism, which is, and I've also written on this as well, that consumerism, I would argue, is primarily a spiritual problem that manifests itself economically. And like Peter Berger makes this distinction between those things which are intrinsic to capitalism and those things which are like extrinsic or exacerbated by it. And I would say consumerism is the latter. It's exacerbated by it. I do not mean that, it's not irrelevant, no big deal, or, markets are just morally neutral things. I don't mean any of that. But I think that the fact that you see this writer who actually calls himself at least one point a socialist, writing about consumerism in a communist system, a socialist system, I think is just revelatory that consumerism is not simply an economic thing. So I think that's one point. But what's really struck me too is, there are increasing critiques of market economies for various reasons. One is just because it's kind of a utilitarian way of looking at the world. You see, it doesn't. Chris Arnott talks about this. It doesn't value non-credentialed layers of meaning. It hurts the poor. It leads to consumerism, and there's some truth there. And again, offshoring and all the debates that we could get into. But what struck me about Havel here is I really like his argument for what I'll call free commerce, or whatever you want to talk about it, because again, it's this forest and the trees that I mentioned. Yes, there are absolute problems that come in a market economy. We have to be attentive to them. But there's also something about economic liberty that's not there just because it's efficient. And I think free marketers have made the error of maybe arguing on efficiency. It's kind of related to the error of thinking that communism is simply an economic system. But actually, there's a place for commercial activity inside of free economy because it allows for plurality. It allows for difference. It allows for human expression. And so there's this tension between the people in the play you identify, who identify themselves by everything they own, and then also the need for what he calls a plurality of economic initiatives. He says, where there is no plurality of economic initiatives, the interplay, this is quote, of competing producers and their entrepreneurial ideas disappears, along with the interplay of supply and demand, labor and commodity markets, etc. Gone too are the stimuli to creativity and its attendant risks, the drama of economic success and failure. Man as a producer ceases to be a participant or a creator in the economic story and becomes an instrument. Everyone's an employee of the state, which is the proprietor of economic truth and power. And he says, when economic plurality disappears, the motives for competition in the marketplace of consumer goods disappear, right? And then it's just satisfying these differentiated needs. And then he gives this example, which maybe you can develop, of the centralized furniture where everybody has the same stuff. So anyway, I talked for a long time there. But laying out this, I think it's really interesting to look at Havel, who's both critical of consumer society and then makes this argument for the importance of plurality of economic initiatives and freedom, not just because it's economically efficient or gets you more stuff, which is really a Marxist analysis of why it's important, but because it allows for creativity and plurality. Could you develop that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know if I can do a better job than you've just done, but I think Havel sees that again. It's not just that communist governments, because of their planning and centralization, are inefficient, but that it takes away people's personal responsibility and liberty, to contribute to the economic life and material well-being of the nation in their own way. And so, it's not just a question of efficiency for Havel, although I don't think he is under any illusions that market economies are market economies are much better than planned economies. But I think you're right to emphasize the extent to which he thinks that it's just a much deeper question than efficiency. I mean, one of Havel's political opponents, Václav Klaus, who is the president of the Czech Republic after Havel. Klaus called himself a devotee of people like Friedman and Hayek, and was much more orthodox in his kind of free market thinking than Havel. And I think their disagreement centered on this question of, is the market an end in itself or not? And I think Havel said, that it's the market is good because it allows people to participate in the economy and produce things and deploy their creativity in interesting ways. And for the most part, it's more efficient. But does that mean that a more open market is always the answer, in every context? Probably not, right? And so he and Klaus went back and forth in the post-communist years on this question. Havel always emphasized the need to think about civil society in a kind of more organic way, right? And not to think about individuals and markets and as producers always. And so I think you're exactly right. I don't know. I was thinking about this when we talked about the podcast last week. It's interesting to think about why Havel called himself a socialist and what way he thought of himself as a socialist, and I don't know the answer to that. Maybe he thinks of himself as a socialist in a kind of non-revolutionary sense, right? That he's in favor of equality, and he doesn't. He's not, certainly not in favor of socialism in the sense of one party that is responsible for bringing us into the glorious future. But yeah, I'll just have to think about that a bit more and see if I can find some things, find an answer to that question.
Yeah, it's interesting. We'll just talk briefly and move on. But it's in actually where I read it is in in the interview called "It Always Makes Sense to Tell the Truth." And somebody asks him, "You were never part of the Communist Party. Why not?" And he said, "I consider myself a socialist. I think I even have been taken something from Marxism, but I've never identified with the ideology of communist movement. In other words, I've never been a communist, and therefore naturally I've never been in the Communist Party." And he goes on. He said, partially because that is probably because the world appears to me 1,000 times more complex and mysterious than it does to communists. Which I think is right. I don't know enough about this, but like it all kind of depends on what you mean by socialism. If you mean by socialism what socialists mean, right? That it doesn't seem like he fully is a socialist because I think he values the family, right? I think he values private property and economic initiative. He wasn't religious, I don't think, but he seems to value religion. And like socialism, like if you look at say definitions from Marx and Engels and the Frankfurt School, I mean those things are obstacles to socialist reform. So it seems to me like it'd be interesting to figure out what does he mean. Maybe he believes in society. I don't know. I mean, he's obviously. I don't want to pretend like I know what he's saying here. I mean, he's obviously a genius and a courageous one at that. So that's where I saw that. So let's actually switch to a couple more things before we end. Thanks again. Really appreciate your time. I have just a couple of maybe unrelated, maybe the related questions. One thing that struck me as I was reading the letter to Dr. Husak is he talks about something that I think is related. It actually is related to the idea of dissent, which is I'd like to end with dissent because I think it's just so important and really challenging just even to me right now. What does a dissent mean? But let me ask this question. He's talking about in the letter to Dr. Husak, this idea of life has been, as we talked about, life has been kind of pushed down, but he said it's not going to last. So he says on page 76, the authorities are certainly still strong enough to prevent vital conflicts, right, or rivalry to power, but they no longer have the strength to resist this pressure altogether. And this is a really great line. He says, quote, "So life vents itself where it can, in the secret corridors of power, where it can, insists on a secret discussion, and finally in secret competition." And he goes about like life comes out. And then on page 81, he said, he talks about, again, this idea that life is going to emerge, right? And one of the things that strikes me when I was reading this is a couple of times, both in this and in other essays, he talks about this idea of he says, life cannot, this is page 75, life cannot be destroyed for good, then neither can history be brought to its entirety to a halt. And he talks about in communist life, there are all these like state events, gymnastic events, a calendar of nothingness or whatever he calls that. I forget the exact word, but it's just like meaningless calendar events that keep going on and keep going on. But it's not real, and everybody knows it's not real. And I was contrasting that with some of the work of Joseph Pieper, who writes like In Tune with the World and Theory of Festivity, and then also like Only the Lover Sings, Art and Contemplation, that the difference between, say, Labor Day or a national event, a political event, right, and a liturgical event, and the spontaneity of liturgical life that gets you out of the quotidian workaday world and really addresses your humanity. that the communist states tried to create these type of rituals, but they really empty. I don't know if you've read Pieper on this, but maybe you could talk about that. I think it was really striking, and I see this even today, like the kind of consumerization of all of the festivities, and that one of the things we have to do in order to live within the truth in dissent is we actually have to live out the liturgical reality separate from any kind of political element. I mean, yeah, maybe it has political implications, but it's not a political act. It's an act outside of the quotidian of worship and joy and festivity. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think it makes perfect sense. I think Havel, would just emphasize what you said, that the communist effort, right, to infuse life with these national holidays and national celebrations, right, always seems false because it doesn't, come from a place of particularity. Doesn't come from a place of genuine history. There was I'll give you one interesting sort of anecdote about this. The Charter 77, they would issue these documents, protesting this or that human rights violation, or this or that imprisonment of someone, the unjust treatment of this or that person. But they also objected, to educational missteps that they thought the state was making. And so I think it's 84, 85, a charter member, and they never signed these documents. It was always just issued under the broad umbrella of the charter spokesman. But a document was written called A Right to History. And it was a 6 or 7 page document just about the importance of Czechoslovak national history and its history under the Austro-Hungarian Empire and its history with the Catholic Church. And, obviously there's a strong kind of dissenting strain in the Czech Church with Jan Hus. And then there was this famous kind of Battle of White Mountain in the beginning of the 17th century, I think, which is sort of counter-Reformation, Catholic Church coming back and crushing the forces of the dissenters, the Protestants. And Mrs. Bendova told me that after that document was issued, that document created the most conversation and the most waves in the charter community of any document, because there was this vibrant debate about the nature of Czech history and the church, right, and all this stuff. And it sort of signaled to her and signaled to the other people involved in the charter how much of a hungering there was for an attention to genuine, history, what really happened. And so I think that's a signal of what you were just saying, that the communist effort to create this fictive history never succeeds, because it doesn't come from a place of truth. It doesn't come from a place of honesty.
And I think too, especially that if you have history, then you also have the religious aspect. So of a liturgical experience. So Joseph Ratzinger, later Benedict XVI, describes this is again pretty quick. He describes like what's the Jewish liturgy and then a Catholic liturgy look like. So first of all, it has to do with it's connected to the Jewish liturgy, connects to like an agricultural season, right? But it's also connected to an event in history. So the Exodus was an event in history, and then when you celebrate it, it's both a remembrance of that event. It's an expectation of deliverance, right? And there's so it's historical and there's what would be called an anamnesis, like a kind of remembrance. So, and this is the same thing, say, in Catholic liturgy in the Eucharist, right? It's remembering the redemptive act. It's expecting with hope the coming of Christ again. And then it's an anamnesis, it's a remembrance. Do this in memory of me, a making present. So like in the Jewish Seder liturgy, you don't say, what did God do for our ancestors? He said, what did God do for me? Right. And that same thing in the Catholic liturgy, it's a participation there. So in a sense, it's outside of time, right? And this is something the state can't provide, right? Because in one sense, it has deep, profound meaning, but can be used, of course, but in itself, it's not politically useful, right? It's something that has to do with the deepest well springs of what it means to be a human being. And I think that's this tension. And by the way, I think I told you this, but actually one of the ways I started reading Hovel is of course I'd heard of him before and everything, but didn't know very much. But I was reading Benedict XVI's Last Testament, and it's his interview with Peter Saywald, and they asked, like, what political figure do you like? He said, I like Hovel. He's the great man, he says. Vaclav Havel. So anyway, I thought that's kind of interesting to think about this. All right. So last thing I'd like to talk about, and it's a big topic. I mean, there's so much we could do. So we've already.
Can I say one quick thing?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Finish on the point that you just made. So I was just reminded. So this is why Hovel in Power of the Powerless and other places talks a little bit about his discomfort with the term dissent, precisely because it gives it sort of makes the suggestion that this movement that Havel is involved in and others are involved in is a primarily political movement. But as you were just suggesting with your question, your kind of analogy to Pieper, what Havel and the other people think that they're doing is something that's operating at a much deeper level than politics, right? They don't think that they're dissenting from a political system and organizing themselves in a party to create a new party and kind of counter the communists in any overt political way. Elena Hromadkova, another charter member whom I interviewed, said to me, we didn't think we were the dissidents. We thought the communists were the dissidents. They were the ones that were dissenting from reality. And I think you get that sense in Havel too. He wants to make the point that these small rebellious acts are an affirmation of reality. And so, I think Havel realizes especially that there isn't really a better term than dissident. So he sort of accepts it, I think, reluctantly, but I think wants to make the broader point that their movement is not political in the sense in which most Westerners think of politics. It's a much deeper movement than a party that's trying to compete for power.
Yeah, that's actually really helpful, and I think related to what's so inspiring and relevant of his idea of a dissident. And on page 69, he says, people don't actually discover their dissidents until long after they've become one, which I think is a good. He says it springs from motivations far different from the desire for titles or fame, and he also says, as you say, not just politics.
Most people, I mean, if you ask them sort of why they did what they did, they end up, doing this or that, and eventually leads them to become sympathetic to the charter community. It's not like one day they woke up and said, I'm going to join the dissident movement, right? It's rather, most of them, when I interviewed them, would say something like, well, I just couldn't live with myself anymore. I couldn't take the lying. And so they made some seemingly minor concrete act, like the Bendas, for example. You were supposed to have the Soviet flag outside your apartment building on national holidays. And so they just, I'm not going to do that. Again, not because you just suddenly decided to join some political movement, but you couldn't live with yourself doing these things that seemed false.
Yeah, I think two things. One is on page 169, right after that I just read, he says, it's not a profession. He says it's an existential attitude. That's the dissident attitude, is an existential attitude. That is, he says, is in no way the exclusive property of those who've earned the title dissident, just because they happen to have some external conditions like being a writer or something. He says, there are thousands of nameless people who try to live within the truth. And millions who want to, but cannot, perhaps only because to do so in circumstances in which they live, they would need 10 times the courage of those who've already taken the first step. If several dozen are randomly chosen from among all people and put into a special category, this can utterly distort its general picture. It does so in two different ways. Either it suggests dissents are a group of prominent people, a protected species who can do certain things the government won't bother them, right? Or it lends support to the illusion, since there is no more than a handful of malcontents to whom not very much is really being done, all the rest are content, and therefore They are not dissidents at all. But he says, no, that's not all. And he kind of goes on. And I think a couple of things strike me there. One is related to Ratzinger. He actually has a line in one of his essays before his Pope on the rehabilitation of reason. And he talks about the convalescence of reason. And it struck me here as I was reading this to you. He says that one of the that he says that we have this limited view of rationality, which I talk about all the time on this podcast. So all the listeners are like, yes, we know, keep going. But that we've limited reason to the empirical. But he says something very important, and he does this with a lot of different things, truth and progress, et cetera. But with he says, with reason, what's gonna lend to the convalescence of reason, to the healing and rehabilitation of reason, is the resistance of the martyrs in the 20th century who stood up to the lies of totalitarianism. And I mean, there I think is the example. It's just the dissident who it's an existential attitude that says no. And then the other thing that's striking is the literary quality of these essays, the Green Grocer image. This goes to maybe think of what you said, like one day the Green Grocer says, I'm not hanging up the sign. And that little act is the trajectory shift. Just like the Bendas and the Soviet flag, that's the beginning of I will not cooperate with the lie of ideology anymore.
Right. Yeah, and you don't. And I guess Havel, I think, would say you don't know when that movement or where that movement. Moment, when or where that moment will come for particular people. Right. It might vary quite a bit. So you got to kind of be patient and allow people to get there on their own, I think.
Mm-hmm. So why don't we maybe just end by talking just a little bit about this idea of dissent, and he says what he calls living within the truth. And could you just develop for listeners this idea? He spends a lot of time talking about a lot of pages talking about this existential attitude of dissent, and they come in very small ways and sometimes big ways. But it's acts of courage, but it's acts of this desire to live within the truth.
Yeah, just not. I mean, as he says, ideology in the context of these communist systems is this combination of the center of power and the center of truth coming together. So the truth and the only truth that is allowed is proclaimed. By the party and propagated by its instruments, and anyone and everyone is expected to be a participant in propagating the truth of the party, and for Havel, living in truth is precisely not participating in the propagation of these ideological fictions. And so living in truth can be the Green Grocer not putting up a sign. Living in truth could be not putting up the Soviet flag on a national holiday. Living in truth could be refusing to go to the May Day parade. Living in truth could be not raising your hand in a union meeting where you're asked to condemn a fellow worker who's been caught with charter literature that they shouldn't be passing along, right? And so it can take a variety of forms, and it can look quite different. But any attempt to I guess exempt oneself from the propagation of lies can be living in truth. So it's primarily, I think, in the Havelian context in the essay, it's primarily a negative one of kind of opting out. But I think Havel thinks once that opting out gathers some steam, and that opting out takes place in different contexts, maybe in one's own life, and you sort of start to become habituated to doing that, then it leads to a kind of rediscovery of conscience, and I would say a rediscovery of what I just presume you're talking about with rationality, a sort of reinvigoration of the idea that one can navigate the world through one's own reason, and make decisions about the good and what it is and how I can apprehend it, in ways that one could never have predicted before one one went down this path. So I think, just to wrap up, sort of living in truth for Havel initially shows up in a kind of negative way, this refusal to participate in the lies of the regime. And over time, that leads to this rediscovery of conscience, this rediscovery of reason, I guess what Havel might call remoralization.
No, that's very good. Yeah, and I think, again, that's inspiring, because today, how often do we participate in some propaganda? Somebody says something, somebody we see on social media or something or whatever says something. I'm like, oh, okay, well, they said it, and then we don't actually look into it. We just kind of repeat it, right? Mm-hmm. And then it becomes part of our it kind of becomes part of our apparatus of thought. But maybe we haven't reflected upon it. Maybe we haven't used our reason, and we end up, in a sense, kind of cooperating with these things without realizing it. I think the other thing is, like, it's hard. I mean, this is, and I've said this earlier, and I said a number of times, but not raising your hand at the meeting when you're asked to condemn some work with charter literature, everybody thinks they could do it. So I would say, like, to myself and to everyone else, like, let's do a self-examination the way Hovel asks you to do in the literary works. So, like, have you ever been in a meeting when somebody's getting, lambasted for doing something, and you think to yourself, glad it's not me. Just keep your head down. Yeah. Instead of saying, that's not true. I think you're false. I don't think you're erroneously judging that person. I think you're making an error. Or, if the boss does something, or, whatever. I'm just giving kind of day-to-day examples. Or Twitter mobs. I mean, how many things do you not say because, well, I don't want to get hassled, right? And I think that's, this is a kind of a theme, I guess, throughout this whole discussion that we're having, Flagg, is that it's not easy to resist the dominant kind of soft or hard ideologies of an age. But living within the truth, where you have an external standard, not just your own internal standard of, or the standard of the party, but some external standard, is hard.
Yeah, that's why it's fun to teach these things with students, because I try to create situations for them. If you were in such and such a situation in your union meeting in your workplace, and, you had a 8th grade child, right? Would you have done something that might have got you into trouble, such that, your little 8th grader might not have been able to go to the high school? And it's just a fun conversation to have with students, to kind of get them to appreciate how difficult a decision it would have been for someone living in these societies. That this is why I think these essays are kind of fun to talk about and fun to teach.
Yeah, and I think too that give you maybe the first hope. I mean, this is wrong, but the first hope of being able to resist is to realize that you might not. You probably wouldn't, and you'd be afraid.
Well, just as a matter of, percentages.
Yep.
Right? I mean, the answer is if I have a class of 30 people, 1 or 2 people would have, maybe,
yeah.
So it's, the odds aren't good if they're honest. I mean, your comment too about kind of social media made me think too. You can also make the point we were talking about earlier, as far as kind of self-righteousness and kind of dissent becoming hardened itself into a kind of position. The temptation, the connection I sort of see there would be sort of the phenomenon of trolling, right? If you decide to, you think you're a great dissenter by just being obnoxious on Twitter and get a rise out of people, right? It's sort of easy to be seduced into this sort of pseudo dissident mindset where you think you're the great truth teller, but you're not really trying to enter into a conversation with people, right? You're not trying to apprehend reality with someone and to sort of take their viewpoint seriously. You've sort of turned dissent into a kind of testimony to your own virtue. I mean, so in other words, that can become its own kind of virtue signal, which also prevents genuine conversation, genuine kind of thinking.
Right.
thinking together.
Yeah. I mean, it's just like the temptation to think you're just above it. It's just constant for every one of us. I mean, I'm guilty of that. We're all guilty of that. I think the key thing here that it's interesting. I mean, you brought this out, and it just strikes me more and more as we talk and think about it. The key thing for the existentialism that it's not primarily political, right? So, when the Benda family quietly dissents by reading The Lord of the Rings, right? That's an act of dissent. This little journal, going back to that journal. Why is the little journal important? I think you and I talked about this, like Karol Wojtyła, later John Paul II, was doing some really active thing. He was helping Jews escape and kind of in a resistance. But one of his resistance acts was working with a group of people just putting on Polish theater. And I think that those acts are really important. So I give this lecture called on the moral imagination, where I kind of go through what it is, and it's actually episode 20 in this podcast. I published the lecture as an episode, and at the end I go through 15 or so things to build the moral imagination. Some of them are like very theoretical, like expand our understanding of reason and build authentic subjectivity, the importance of both objective and subjective beauty. And some are more practical, like read good stories, read fairy tales, detox, don't watch bad television so that you're not desensitized to evil, and going outside and things. But this conversation with you, Flagg, has actually really added things I need to think a lot about, and hopefully will add to that. And that is, I mean, it's a little bit in there, but you've really kind of enriched it, because like playing music together, singing together, reading beautiful literature, praying, of course, together, and all these things, just little acts of existential dissent from the consumerist world we live in is hard. It's really difficult. And I interviewed a friend, Dr. Carrie Gress, who's a philosopher, and she wrote a book called Theology of Home with Noel Mering. And they talk about like the importance of just making the home look beautiful. And these are small little elements of, in a sense, a dissent from the technocratic view of the world into, I mean, this is, you can tell I'm influenced by Joseph Pieper if you've read Pieper, but this escape from the quotidian for beauty and meaning and kind of liturgical year, et cetera, on its own sake. And that's humanizing. And that's, in a sense, maybe our dissent is we have to dissent from Twitter mobs. We have to dissent from, say, political correctness or ideology on the progressives or the conservatives, but also just dissent from consumerism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we can talk about this next time when we talk about Benda. I mean, but I think this is sort of wrapped up with his idea of the parallel polis and the variety, the myriad ways that he saw social life trying to reassert itself kind of in the midst of this communist domination, whether it be reading groups, underground seminars, the underground church. There's lots of things that we can talk about in the Czechoslovak context, and this was also true. Is also happening in Poland, underground theater. So the kind of the social aspect of all of this is incredibly important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's Toynbee, and then Ratzinger picks it up, of creative minorities.
Yeah,
right. But I think that idea of the parallel polis is a striking one, and something to think about. And that I think today, and maybe we can end here, is that I think today, especially in the context of this is December 2020 that we're having this discussion. We're just at the end of election season, and everything is so hyper politicized that our first reaction, or often the first reaction, is to go into the politics. But you need, in order for politics to be enriched and revitalized, you need the parallel polis. You need this first existential dissent, and you can't just look at everything as a political situation. So it's I don't know. It's, as I'm thinking about it, I mean, maybe I'm getting it wrong. Again, correct me. But it's like we go through this conversation, I think, wow, here we have the great Vaclav Havel and his political dissent against totalitarianism. This is the course you teach, right, in political dissent and totalitarianism, and Benda. And what do we get is maybe you should just get together with your family and put a fire together, and read Lord of the Rings. And it doesn't, and I don't mean that in a light way, but I mean like that also is in a sense the beginning, the kindling, the tinder of dissent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, well, good. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to me, and so definitely, I'll have you back, and we'll talk about Václav Benda,
the other Vaclav,
yeah, the other Vaclav, we could probably have a whole series with you if you're willing. I'd be happy to, on all the great dissident philosophers and thinkers and writers, and I think there's so much to learn from them, and it's important to remember these things. We can't let that go by. We have to remember these really important thinkers who were intellectually serious and had great courage. So it's super inspiring. Good. All right. Well, thank you, Flagg, and all the best to you. And we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Michael.
Thank you.